Hi everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining us for this Leaders Live debate on hydrogen for life. My name's Rob Dale. I'm from a political strategic communications agency called Beyond 2050. I'm going to be your host, and we're joined by three expert panelists. I'm joined here in the studio by Mark Selby from Ceres Power, Dr. Jennifer Baxter from Protium, and Bjorn Nowak from Bosch Powertrain Solutions. I'm going to say a quick introduction, then I'll open it to the guests to say a bit about themselves and their organisation, and then we'll open it up into a general debate. Whilst we're talking, we are going to be having some poll questions that are going to be flashing up on your screen, so when we ask you to participate in them, we'll be really grateful if you could give us your response, and understand you can do it on your phone or on your laptop, whatever's easiest for you. But we're also going to be inviting you to ask questions to the panel throughout the session, and towards the end of the session we'll do a Q&A based on those questions, so please do start sending them in as well. Now, today's debate is taking place at a really timely moment, particularly here in the UK. There's been a lot of talk for really probably the last 12 months about the need for the UK to have a hydrogen strategy, so that we don't risk falling behind this global hydrogen race that's emerging. There's been a huge amount of political engagement and media activity on it. The strategy was potentially going to be coming out this week, possibly even today. It now looks set to be coming out next Thursday. So for the UK, we're at a really quite pivotal point in our development of a hydrogen economy, and I'm sure particularly Mark and Jennifer's comments will speak to that. But as a quick introduction or about me, as I say, I'm essentially a political lobbyist, so I've been working with a network of over 60 organisations over the past 12 months for a campaign called Hydrogen Strategy Now. And we've united organisations from across the hydrogen supply chain, heat, transport, blue, green. It's all been about hydrogen as a good thing for the UK. We slightly got things wrong when it came to battery technology, and we slightly got things wrong when it came to wind, and we didn't maximise that job creation and economic opportunity. And really, industry's united around a call to say, let's not make sure we do that again. Let's make sure we bring forward the policies, not necessarily the funding from government, but the policies we need from government to give private organisations the confidence to invest soon, and start making the jobs and driving the investment and technology production here in the UK. So it's a really pivotal moment, and I'm sure we'll come into that further as we discuss. But I'll now introduce the panel. I'll go to you, Mark, first, because you're here in the studio. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, Ceres, and I guess while we're also introducing yourselves, could you give us, just for the audience, because obviously not everyone at home is going to be an expert in hydrogen like you are, could you just give us a sense of what hydrogen means to your organisation, where you see hydrogen being first used by your organisation or the technology you produce?
Yeah, okay, sure, thanks, Rob. So I'm Mark Selby. I'm Chief Technology Officer of a company called Ceres. I'm an engineer by background. What Ceres does is we develop electrochemical technologies, and we transfer those technologies through licenses to companies like Bosch and Doosan and various other companies around the world. What's an electrochemical technology? Well, electrochemistry is the bridge between molecules and electrons, and that's really important when you think about decarbonising the next phase of society. We have lots of renewable resources like wind and solar, and we actually need to turn those into molecules in order to do all sorts of things in society. So these technologies are really important for helping use renewable energy and turn it into molecules like hydrogen. What that means is we can start to decarbonise things like plastics, like shipping, like aircraft, like cars, like heating homes. So these technologies are really important, and you probably can't do them as one company. So we help other companies decarbonise their product lines, and that's why we've got a great relationship with Bosch and some of those other great names. In that context, what's hydrogen to Ceres? Well, hydrogen is a system technology. It's not one thing that solves one problem. It's probably the second best solution to quite a lot of the problems we'll talk about today, but there are some things that only hydrogen can do. Now, whether that's decarbonising shipping or decarbonising steel or decarbonising industrial heat, doesn't really matter. If those problems are big and valuable problems, it will happen because they have to be solved. And therefore, hydrogen is going to be an absolute cornerstone technology, all the way from production, logistics, storage, consumption, to this next phase of decarbonisation.
Great, thank you, Mark. Bjorn, if I can go to you next, please.
Hi and welcome. So, as an introduction of myself, my background is engineering. Now I'm assigned as a project director for sustainable mobility strategy. And why did we start a project on strategy? It's simply because European Union made it very clear they are determined to fix technologies or particular technologies under their ambitious climate targets that the consumers might not even have seen before they could really make a choice which of those technologies serves them best in their particular needs. And so for us and for me, being from the mobility sector, my role is and my desire is to support that electricity, battery electric vehicles, hydrogen electric vehicles, and also derivatives of hydrogen are enabled to play their important role in the future transportation sector.
Thank you, Bjorn. And Dr. Baxter?
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. My name's Jen Baxter. I'm the Director of Innovation and Policy at Protium Green Solutions. Protium is a net zero energy company, and our focus is on the development of green hydrogen infrastructure. We focus our attention across 3 pillars, and that's aviation, industrial heat, and mobility. And the way in which we think about hydrogen is that it is part of a wider decarbonisation process, and working in parallel with electricity, we need to ensure that every aspect of our lives are decarbonised. So this means, as Mark's pointed out, that there are areas where electricity is not the most appropriate technology in order to decarbonise, and we have to come up with a solution that allows us to work quickly to make sure that we move ourselves away from fossil fuels in those areas. So industrial heat is a great example, where previously things like kerosene have been used in order to produce heat in factories. We can switch that out for hydrogen and start to think about how we develop that process differently. Another important aspect of how we think about hydrogen is its opportunity for decentralization of the energy system. Already today, hydrogen is often produced where it's used, and we can continue to do that.
Thank you, Jan. In your response then, Dr. Baxter, you mentioned green hydrogen, and I think it's going to be one of our questions that will come up on the poll later. I think the conversation about hydrogen can sometimes get confusing because there's lots of different colours. So could you just give a very quick run through of what the colours are, but also, I guess, answer the question, should we be thinking of hydrogen in terms of colours, or should we just be thinking hydrogen is hydrogen, it doesn't matter what colour it is?
So it's important to reflect that today the majority or almost all hydrogen is produced using fossil fuels. So that's through the partial gasification of oil, of coal, and the steam methane reforming of gas. And there is no carbon capture and storage. So today, most hydrogen produced and used is a dirty fuel. And we have to do something to change that. So that's where we then start to think about blue hydrogen, and that uses similar processes, but actually captures some of that carbon and stores it away. And then green hydrogen, the process there is to take electricity from renewables, use an electrolyzer to split water, and to take the hydrogen and oxygen from those as saleable commodities. So that's how we are separating it out. There are many others, there are colours, but really we should be thinking about, as much as possible, low carbon hydrogen in the early days with a move to green hydrogen in the long term.
Thank you. And something I saw from a presentation a few weeks ago is there are millions of tons of hydrogen already used across the world in industrial processes. So even if we don't look at hydrogen for new technology just to decarbonise existing use, there is still going to be a need for a huge amount of decarbonised hydrogen production. And then when we start to get into buses, trains, heat, it's just going to significantly increase. But one thing that's already come out already is the case for it could be, you said it could be second best. And we also have to talk about where can it be used first. So could we maybe just explore how do we go to find out where it will be either the best solution or where we should be looking to focus use of it first? Mark, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think context for these things is everything, isn't it? The question about best is maybe less helpful than the question about where it's the only solution. So, or the only economic solution is quite often the interesting way to look at it. So if you look at something like how do you decarbonise steel? At the moment, steel uses lots of heat and we use lots of coal in order to provide the reducing agent. If you want to stop digging up coal and turning that into CO2 in steel production, you have to use technologies like hydrogen and some partial electrification. So that's the only economic solution for that problem. So if we really are serious about a net zero transition, it is going to produce enormous amounts of hydrogen for those industries. So then the question is, well, if you're producing it at enormous scale and the economies of scale come to bear, it's almost unimaginable that it won't find its way into some of those other applications where there is competition. So cars is a great example. I think you might make the argument for small passenger cars, the market's already spoken, that's direct electrification. Does that work for all transport? Probably not. Charging buses up is a real challenge if you think about pure electric mass transit. So hydrogen buses, that probably makes sense. That's probably the most economic solution for decarbonising passenger transport in that heavy duty sector. So I think what you'll find is there are some industries that are so valuable that absolutely need this, that the economies of scale will come to bear in hydrogen, and then they will naturally follow through into some of those second best applications, because markets love competition and those dynamics really help drive progress.
Yeah, just on that, I do a lot of work actually with a UK bus manufacturer that have a specialism in hydrogen buses. I was looking into this the other day. There was a bus depot for 160 buses in Glasgow, was going to require the equivalent power for 10,000 people. There are 40,000 buses in the UK, so if you do back of a fag packet maths for that, that means if they were all to go to EV buses, that would be the equivalent amount of electricity of 2.5 million people.
Yeah, okay.
That's like new power stations level amount of electricity just to decarbonise buses, let alone cars, trains and all the rest of it. Bjorn, Dr. Baxter, what do you think in terms of where hydrogen could or should be used first, and how we are best finding out those best first use cases?
If I start with my answer, I think the debate should not be so much focused on where do we start with the first use case whatsoever. I think, like Mark said, first of all, we need to find out what are qualified application sectors for low carbon or zero carbon hydrogen, because ultimately our target is to become climate neutral at the end of the day. So we need to find out who is qualified to use hydrogen. And the next question would then be who could afford to buy hydrogen, because speed is important. We need to ramp up production of green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and all the other colors which are climate neutral. We need to speed it up, and that's how our economy runs and how our economy was very successful the past decades. So we need to find out which sector is qualified and which sector has ability to pay so that we could immediately start. Why to wait 1 decade or 2 decades until aviation is capable of absorbing hydrogen or other sectors? Just make a list which sector is qualified and then let the market play their role, because anyway, the ecosystem of hydrogen and its derivatives is so complex. I don't think that any plan, even from the best mastermind, would be really executable for the next 3 decades on the way towards zero.
Thank you. We're getting ready for our first poll question, which is, will we be able to produce enough green hydrogen to reach demand? So, Dr. Baxter, if there's any other comments from the previous question you want to make, but could you also maybe talk to the poll question now about, because you mentioned green hydrogen as well in your opening comments, do you think we will be able to meet enough green hydrogen, let's say by 2050, for the amount of demand that there might be for it?
So I think the answer to this feeds in a little bit to what Bjorn's just said, and some of it is around identifying both those technological sectors that will use hydrogen, but also different regions will have more of a focus on hydrogen than others. So for example, more rural areas may benefit more from hydrogen than cities do, because cities have better access to the electrical grid. So there is an element of understanding that. And then when you then work backwards from there, understanding what your hydrogen demand is allows you to work back to how much green hydrogen you need to produce and where you can produce it. So we've seen recently that there has been quite a lot of news stories about very large renewable energy companies moving into hydrogen. So we can see that there is a move in that direction. And I think what we will ultimately see is that the demand will feed the supply chain. One of the problems that we have today is that the supply chain is not currently in place to support the development of green hydrogen infrastructure, which means that early projects are taking longer to develop than they will do by 2030, 2040, 2050, when that supply chain is in place. We've seen similar things with the electrification of the railways, where there are big gaps between when electrification is done, you have to build up a big supply chain again. And it's exactly the same here as it was with the wind industry as well.
Right. Thank you. Bjorn or Mark, have you got any comments about whether we'll be able to produce enough green hydrogen to reach demand? Mark?
Yeah, okay. I mean, my view on this is, this comes back to this idea of valuable problems. If there are valuable problems that have to be solved, markets will react, people will invest capital. I think one of the big myths in this space is somehow that the electricity required to produce this hydrogen is somehow fixed at the size of the current grid, or is somehow measured against how much electricity people consume, and will make hydrogen when they're not consuming it. I think when you think about hydrogen being a valuable solution to industrial problems, to heavy transport and some of those other things, actually we'll invest in renewable electricity to go way beyond the amount of electricity we consume directly as electrons. So I think this idea that somehow there's a cap on how much green hydrogen we can produce is a myth. There isn't a cap on how much data we consume on the internet. There isn't a cap on, it turns out, how much oil we can dig out of the ground. Why should there be a cap on how much renewable energy we can exploit as hydrogen and directly? So I think in some ways I have a challenge with this question, because I think the premise is flawed.
Bjorn, do you think the premise is flawed too of this question?
I fully agree. I don't see why there should be a limit on the production capacities that are available on green hydrogen, but probably there is a limitation on the speed that we could scale up. That's driven by the demand side, but there's also probably from the supply side when it comes to supply chains. So we know 2 or 3 most important technologies to produce electrolyzers, but all of them, they also have the hiccups when it comes to the pressures or the minerals that we have to use there. So as it is for the electric vehicle discussion, I'm quite sure if we really scale up into the giga scale of electrolyzers, we also need to have a look at the supply chains producing electrolyzers, that they can go with the right speed. And the longer we stay fixed in our discussions about target, and the longer we stay about colors of hydrogen that we want to use, the more time we are losing to build up powerful supply chains.
Yeah, so I guess the key message from that is we need to crack on now, and with pace and ambition. We're going to go to the answers from the poll now, which I hope people can see on their screen. And essentially it's a pretty mixed picture. And perhaps the fact that don't know comes out top shows maybe the current state that we're in with policy development and investment decisions, which is there's lots of excitement and opportunity, but perhaps there's not as much happening on the ground as what we might like now. But interesting, I think that only 25%, the lowest of the 3 bars, was people expressing confidence that we will be able to produce enough. And I guess, Bjorn, I'm going to come to you for the next question, because one thing, as I say, I've been working a huge amount particularly with parliamentarians, to help them get excited around the opportunity that hydrogen represents in the UK for not just decarbonisation, but for jobs and economic growth. And the thing that they've been campaigning for is a hydrogen strategy to be developed in the UK. And it's my understanding that you were quite heavily involved with the development of the European hydrogen strategy. So could you talk us through perhaps what you think are some of the strengths of that strategy, reflecting on how it looks, are there any emissions from it? And I guess for us here in the UK and for audiences around the world watching this, what are some of the things that we should be looking to from that strategy for inspiration? Appreciate there's kind of three quite chunky bits to that question. But yeah, your key thoughts on that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, so European hydrogen strategy, I think, even the fact that it is there, it's already a strong statement. It helps a lot that European Union made itself the commitment, what is the path forward. And also the ambition level, I think, is a strong signal. Second is, this signal does not only come from domestic production of hydrogen, it also includes energy partnerships, so import routes from favorable locations in the world to produce green hydrogen and transport it to the European Union. I think that's an important signal. We should also stay open to energy, to global energy trade. Otherwise, we already have the next problem built into a geopolitical strategy. So that's also something I like very much from the European strategy. But it's out now for something like 1 year, and we still struggle to come into execution. And that's probably something that we could also consider when formulating other regions' hydrogen strategies. I think it's the easier part to formulate the ambitious target, where most of the people agree on. I think more complex is to stay open to all the technology paths and stay open to all the business models that need to be created within this. And if we start blocking different colors of hydrogen, if we start to define what kind of electric power is eligible to produce green hydrogen, and an electrolyzer runs only for 3, 4, or 5,000 hours a year. So if with all these small things that are now trickling into the picture, I think we are not opening up more options. We are closing them down already before we execute the overall strategy. That's probably an advice that I would like to give to other regions. To execute this kind of ambition level, we need more options, not less. We can reduce the options later on anytime, but in the beginning, to get really started, stay open to all technologies and business models.
Yeah, okay. I think I've heard someone say that basically we need everyone on the pitch because we don't know the right solution. I think that's come through already. But I guess Mark and Dr. Baxter, we understand that the UK hydrogen strategy is now on the desk of the Secretary of State, ready for sign-off. It's gone to number 10 for their review. It's all pretty much ready to go. But if the Secretary of State or his officials were watching this debate, this discussion now, what's the one thing that you would say from your organisation or from a UK perspective that you think absolutely has to be in this document? Dr. Baxter, I'll go to you first with that.
So I think the one thing that if the Secretary of State was listening now is that I would ask if they believe that we should be providing the same level of finance and policy support to the UK that is seen across Europe. I think one of the things that really blew my mind recently when I was looking at Germany is that they already have 100 hydrogen refueling stations across Germany. So there's a realistic possibility that you could own a hydrogen car there and that you could use it and refuel it. Here in the UK, the level of support that is received by companies who want to begin the process of innovating around this and implementing new infrastructure, which is always difficult in an incumbent system. It always is. There's never an easy way to introduce something new. There does need to be financial and policy support to those organisations in order to do that at a level that is equivalent to we see in other decarbonisation areas. And we aren't there yet. So hopefully this new strategy will begin the process of making sure that the UK doesn't miss out on things like wind, which we did in the past, and actually is seen as a leader in developing hydrogen infrastructure technologies and technologies for vehicles as well.
Just specifically on your point around refueling stations, that was a question that the Secretary of State was asked directly by an MP yesterday in front of a select committee, which is, would the strategy contain a target for refueling stations across the UK? And I'm pretty sure his answer was no. So I think there might be some gaps in the strategy that we might want to look at very closely.
And I think that this is where decarbonisation is an important item for the UK. We're hosting the COP this year. If we aren't really saying we want to push decarbonisation through electricity and through hydrogen developments, then we aren't really going to be leaders in this field. It's the one thing that's going to hold us up. If there isn't proper support to develop supply chains, to develop training and understanding for operations of these different technologies, we aren't going to achieve our own targets by 2030.
Great. And Mark, same question. If the Secretary of State was here, what would you say to him?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything Jennifer and Bjorn has said. I think I'd go further. I think we talk about this as a problem, and I've been guilty about this as well, but I think we underestimate the size of the opportunity. There was some great political rhetoric last year with the 10-point plan, and one of those things was let's really drive the UK to be the science superpower. And I said right at the beginning, hydrogen is a system technology. We have to make sure, if the UK is going to prosper in general, that we exploit this opportunity across the whole value chain. And that starts with science, it starts with engineering. It's not just an infrastructure project to build electrolyzers next to wind farms. It has to be that whole value chain. There is an opportunity for infrastructure projects. There is an opportunity for product companies to build electrolyzers. There are technology solutions for storage and transport, and there are really valuable science problems to help other companies around the world meet their own decarbonisation goals. So I'd say two things. Make sure you exploit the whole opportunity, and think about this as a UK technology opportunity for global problems, not a UK opportunity for UK problems.
Great, thank you, Mark. We're going to our next poll question now, which is: are you more likely to use hydrogen in the home or for travel, or both? Jennifer, if I can come to you first quickly on this. We won't spend long on this question because the poll's been out for a while and there's still a few more things we want to get through. But just quickly, do you think we're more likely to see hydrogen used in domestic heating uses or for travel, or do you think it will be a mixture of both?
I think in the early days, it's going to be primarily in some of the hard to decarbonise areas, so industrial heat, aviation, some of the big vehicles. When we think about what happens domestically, I think some of this will come down to, as Mark's mentioned, how we actually access all of the opportunities for new technologies and within the UK. So if we get really good production technologies for green hydrogen, if we get really good systems that allow hydrogen to be used in the home, whether that's through fuel cells or boilers, then yes, we may well see that. But I think domestic use of hydrogen in the home, that's not in vehicles, but in the home, is something that is further away perhaps than the larger industrial uses.
Would you agree with that? That hydrogen for use in the home is further away, is more closer to the the 2050 timeline? Sorry, that question's to you, Bjorn.
Oh, okay, thanks. I don't like the either or approach in the question. What we see here in the first quarters or areas of cities already evolving is that we build new locations in cities where we are harvesting as much renewable energy as somehow possible. So be it wind or solar, whatsoever. And we see that they have the same problem of transferring energy from day to night, from weekend to weekday, and also from summer to winter. At least in Germany, we have this big issue between renewable energy and energy demand between summer and winter being very different. And this is where we see storing excess renewable energy locally in a long-term storage as power to X, probably hydrogen, is really a big helpful thing. And this connects perfectly to also transportation needs in person mobility at this spot, but also in the last mile delivery of goods could be used. So I don't think it's either or. I think both will develop more or less at the same time, because from a system point of view, it makes sense.
Okay. And would you agree with that, Mark? It's more of a let's do it all at the same time in a systems-based approach.
I agree with the systems-based approach. And you have to look at these things as systems. It's the way to be efficient and productive in terms of what you do. I think this question, it's worth putting some numbers around, and the thing about predictions is you're always guaranteed to be wrong, but there are some really good bits of work done looking at some of the different decarbonisation pathways. I think one of the most recent ones is from an organisation called the Energy Transitions Commissions. And they've tried to put some numbers around where they think hydrogen will be used and what solutions will be used in a 2050 timescale. If you take some of those hard to decarbonise sectors, so Jennifer mentioned transport, industrial heat, if you add ammonia to that and shipping, those 4 sectors alone are worth about 400 megatons. If you were to use hydrogen in travel, everywhere you possibly could, you end up with about 40 megatons. So this idea that it's cars is a big part of the hydrogen thing, or even buses, or even all transport, is a myth. It's about industry. And that's the thing we have to really get on with and get pace on. And that's good, because those guys have got big, valuable problems, and they have deep pockets. This is not purely about government. It's not purely about policy. It's also about corporates standing behind the problems they've created and moving forwards.
Thank you. We'll go to the results of the poll now. Again, it's pretty evenly split. So 41% of people saying they're going to be using it in the home. So I guess that's good for Bosch and the development of your hydrogen-ready boilers. But then it's going to be good for 44% of people are saying it's going to be used in travel. So I presume some people in that market thinking they're going to be using a hydrogen car at some point in the future as well. Which makes the case for the hydrogen refueling network you were discussing, Jen. Bjorn, when you were speaking about the hydrogen strategy in Europe, you talked about international supply chains of moving hydrogen around. When I've spoken to a lot of MPs, where I can tell it's been their first ever conversation about hydrogen. So this is maybe kind of 2-3 years ago when I was having these conversations. And one of the first things they always ask, or one of the first 3 questions was always, is hydrogen safe? So I guess my understanding is we're basically at the point now where we've proven technologically that hydrogen is safe. But if we were to start moving ships of hydrogen or through pipelines between different countries, do you think that is going to start to re-raise some safety questions? Or do you think that we're kind of so used to moving oil and other stuff around that that's not really going to come up? Bjorn, what do you think?
Let me start with the pipelines. I don't think that hydrogen pipeline offers particular more severe risks than we would already have with methane pipelines. So of course you have all these security safety issues with gaseous pipelines because they are sometimes crossing not so nice states or regions. But I don't think that this makes a difference towards what we have today from the methane. I wouldn't think, or our analysis don't show a big role of hydrogen being shipped as a chemical carrier, because we have the compressed gas ships, which will have very, very low payload. Then we have the liquefied, so the cryogenic part with liquefied hydrogen. Again, the density of liquefied hydrogen is not what we know already now from crude oils, gasoline, diesel fuels. So we don't see it as a practical way of carrying energy across the globe. So that's why shipping, in my understanding, would always be a power to liquid process. There would be a derivative used. And then, of course, the question arises, would we reconvert those energy carriers to hydrogen to put it into use cases, or don't we then use the derivatives immediately? That was also my point in the beginning. One of the technology open paths should also accept that we can create hydrocarbon fuels which are climate neutral, and those will really support global imports.
Thank you. Jen or Mark, do you have any points in terms of when people ask you, is hydrogen safe? What's your standard response to that?
I mean, the place I go with this is, I think it's about familiarity. There are lots of things that people will, when they're unfamiliar with, have concerns around safety. So I'm old enough to remember when the first Walkmans were around and parents telling me that there was going to be an epidemic of deaf people. Now, it didn't happen. I can remember families that had microwave detectors in their kitchens because their microwaves were going to leak radiation into their kitchens. My experience of how society adapts to technology is when utility is proven, industry demonstrates safety and people become comfortable and familiar with the technology. And hydrogen will be no different. I mean, would you walk around with a bottle of gasoline in your pocket? No, it's pretty dangerous. But we know how to handle it. We learn how to treat it. We don't spread it around. We keep it in closed containers. And we're pretty good at doing that. And hydrogen will have to be the same. There will be protocols and engineering and practice that needs to be learned and developed. But it's not intrinsically a dangerous thing.
And Dr. Baxter, what do you say when people ask you the safety question?
I think it builds a little bit on what Mark's just said about understanding risk and how we manage risk as a society. And I think that often the way in which new technologies are portrayed many times by the media is it's very sort of polarizing. So people get a message that it's dangerous or it's more dangerous, but there aren't really any real comparisons made to other things that we do with our lives. I think slightly separately to managing risk, there are other things that are happening at the moment in terms of managing hydrogen developments around regulation and standards. And so something that isn't often talked about in terms of the whole innovation system is that a lot of these applications that we are now using hydrogen for are new applications, or they're new processes, or the technologies put together in a different way, which means that we have to create new standards and regulations that apply to these different bits of infrastructure. And that takes time. And this is actually something that is probably taking slightly longer than we would expect. If you look at aviation, for example, there's no regulation or protocols really that cover the use of hydrogen in aircraft. So we're having to develop those as we go along. And that's done, the regulator works with industry in order to develop new standards, new regulations for new technologies. And that's all part of the process of ensuring the safety of anything that we use in our everyday lives. People walk around in the built environment, coming into contact with engineering all the time and assume that it's safe, and they don't ask the questions that they ask about new technologies. So I think when we think about decarbonisation and the new energy system that we're going to have, this system is being asked to be 100% perfect before we even build it. And the system that we currently use is nowhere near 100% perfect or safe. So we have to kind of balance out those risks and understand them a little better.
Absolutely. I think the one point you said was really critical, which is the regulatory system doesn't often keep pace with technological innovation. For example, I was at JCB a few weeks ago, and they are developing hydrogen internal combustion engines. And I didn't understand the process at all, but it seems that, when these diggers are out in fields, they can't obviously be going to and from a petrol station every time they need to fill up. The standard is you have a big tank of diesel that they can just plug into. But at the minute, there is very restrictive regulation to allow a similar process to allow just for the transportation of hydrogen. So take all the technological requirements out of the way. It's just that the regulation, as it stands today, and it's not because someone's looked at it and said, no, that's a bad idea. It's just because no one's ever looked at it and thought, well, hydrogen could be an option here, because it's never been technically possible to do. So I think one thing, kind of post-publication of the hydrogen strategy here in the UK and obviously other places across the world, is to make sure that officials are moving fast and open-minded, so that when these new wrinkles in the system emerge, they're able to move fast and not prevent the introduction of these technologies, which is ultimately going to mean we continue to emit more carbon into the atmosphere. We're going to go to the fourth question now, which is on your screen. So it's got various options on the screen here, but the question is, what aspects of hydrogen are most important to you? So while you're voting at home, we'll go around the panel again. Bjorn, if I could start with you on this one. Of the list that I hope you can see in front of you, if not, I can read them out to you. The questions
read them out, please, because I have black screen here.
Most important to you, hydrogen can be used in travel, making hydrogen carbon neutral, how countries transition to hydrogen, hydrogen can be used in our homes, hydrogen can be used in the workplace, or understanding how hydrogen works. What aspects of that from that list of hydrogen is most important to you?
So what I got was that's a consumer's perspective. So what could I do best with hydrogen? Am I right?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I guess you in your role, what aspects of hydrogen and its deployment are going to be most most significant to you or your organization?
Then for this, thanks for this rephrasing. Then I have a clear answer, and this was still also not covered in the discussion we had so far. Hydrogen is not only a simple molecule as an energy carrier. So I also provided a slide which you could probably share with the screen and with the spectators here. Hydrogen is not only a simple molecule. In the background, there is a huge and complex ecosystem. So we need to produce hydrogen from renewable energy. We need to distribute it on various paths, being via pipeline, via ships, power to liquid processes. And then it finally reaches the application sectors. And again, we have to differentiate between, do we do the electrolysis on site, so where we need hydrogen? Do we do it off site, where we have the excess renewable energies? So very complex pictures, lots of technologies that has to be developed, and this brings deployment. So we should also look at hydrogen as an enabler for massive employment. Even when I talk to people who are also experts in the mobility sector, they are often focusing the discussion on fuel cell technology. So they mean we build square meters, square kilometers. I think Mark knows how this stacking is done. That's a highly automated process. We have to repeat the same procedure millions of times. Employment factor is moderate, R&D high, but employment in plants is rather low. And that is where I would also like to bring the focus of the discussion probably to those accessories we need to operate a fuel cell. The fuel cell doesn't breathe. It can't take its own air and get the water steam out at the end of the process. So we need to bring air in. So what I have here, for example, in my hand is an electric air compressor. So that's an electric machine, rated power in the area, what we know from small passenger cars, but it has to spin at very high speeds because it's a compressor type of thing, and it has to fulfill very tough package issues. So we bring here 20, 25 kilowatts in a very tiny environment with a lot of precise machining parts in it, and complex technology. So this is really driving employment. I'm quite sure the same is true for electrolyzers in plants, for the control of microgrid or grid connectors with hydrogen. And that's a key thing about hydrogen that starts to come up more and more to the surface in the German and European discussion. That's something where the European industry could have a leading role in the world, because all the other regions will have the discussion about hydrogen in the future.
Thanks, Bjorn. Mark, what part of hydrogen is most important to you?
I think the most important thing is A, we get on with it, and B, that it's carbon neutral.
Dr. Baxter, what part of hydrogen is most important to you?
So I'm going to take a slightly different approach here. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, the majority of the time we talk about what we emit to atmosphere. We don't tend to talk about the emissions that we consume through the products that we buy. So if I flip myself around and stop being a hydrogen developer and become a consumer of goods and services, then there is a lot of emissions within that. And one of the brilliant things about hydrogen is it has the opportunity to decarbonize things like food processing, which a lot of people don't ever think about how many carbon emissions are consumed within their food. So it gives us an opportunity to think about it. It gives us an opportunity to decarbonize steam in the fashion industry, of all places. There are all sorts of things where we could think about, what am I doing as a consumer, and where am I buying my products from, and what processes do they use in order to produce those? And even if you think about overseas, so we are, I think, the largest net importer of greenhouse gas emissions from overseas, because we've offshored so much manufacturing. This actually enables us to think about, how do we use hydrogen, not just here in the UK, but how do we influence others to use hydrogen elsewhere within the supply chains?
Great, thank you. We'll close this question here. So top, and this links to something you said, Mark, which is the most important to the most people who have voted, is making carbon neutral. But that's quite interesting, because I think the answer to the first question was, are we going to be able to produce enough green hydrogen? So clearly people want us to be making green hydrogen, but there's a lot of skepticism that we might not be able to make all of that. Then second was how countries transition to hydrogen. So clearly that's a key part of why we've put so much emphasis on the UK developing a hydrogen strategy, why the EU one is so important, and then third is how hydrogen can be used in travel. Least important was how hydrogen can be used in the workplace. So Mark, I know we've talked about it before, but can you just explain, so why is making carbon neutral so important? Why is it so important to most people? Why did you pick upon that in your answer?
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's an analogy with sort of mountain climbing. When we talk about decarbonisation over the next 50 years, getting to 80% of current decarbonisation is like getting to the top of the Matterhorn. That was first climbed in 1850. That last 20% is like getting to the top of Everest, and that wasn't climbed till 1950. Yeah? We haven't got 100 years to do that last 20%. Hydrogen is the only technology, if it's carbon neutral, that allows us to go on that last 20% of the journey to net zero. Therefore, the hydrogen we make must be carbon neutral, it must be now, and we must get on with this at scale and pace.
Do you think there's kind of a sense at the minute, and it's something that is sometimes used back at people like me who are sort of advocating for hydrogen, which is that this is a myth. Hydrogen is not as good as what people think it is, or is not the silver bullet. Do you think, is there anything that we could get halfway down the line with hydrogen and then think, oh, actually, there was a better solution all along? Like, is hydrogen it, or do you think there is something beyond hydrogen that we've not yet come across that could do things quicker, cheaper, or easier?
I mean, it comes back to that question about we need everyone on the pitch, or we need every tool in the box. There are technologies that sit alongside hydrogen, and I think it will come down to sort of the order in which you deploy them. If you can, you should electrify something. Direct electrification is the fastest and lowest cost way of decarbonising many of the things we do. But then there are a whole range of things that you cannot electrify. Simply, the chemistry doesn't work. They need molecules. And so what are the carbon-free things that underpin that last journey? And I don't see anything that is not either hydrogen or something derived from hydrogen that allows you to go on that journey.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Baxter, your comment then was about how much energy goes into things that we as consumers, how much goes into the thing to get things to our doors. We're seeing increasingly that there is scrutiny in terms of the amount of electricity that goes into producing, batteries for electric cars. There was a big piece in the Times here in the UK this morning. I think the title was "How Green Really Are Electric Vehicles." That scrutiny is now starting to be deployed to electric vehicles because they're entering, mass adoption. So I guess, if that similar question was applied to fuel cells? What are the answers to that? What is the amount of energy that goes into the production of the technologies that we're going to be first looking to use to enable the hydrogen market to develop?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question. I think it's a really important one that applies to every new technology. And it's an element of the circular economy, which we hear a lot about when we're talking about greening everything, but we don't necessarily really understand what that means. Now, the circular economy doesn't just apply to recycled plastics, it applies to energy as well. And I think where Mark was talking about net zero and total zero fuel, if you like, that within that system itself, there is a lot of carbon and there's a lot of hydrogen floating around that can be used for lots of different things, whether it's synthetic fuels for other purposes. And when we think much more widely about the materials that we're using and the energy that we're using, we need to understand how that system can continue to use that energy to minimize its impact. And I think at the moment we haven't, as an engineer, I completely understand it, but as a society, we haven't enabled it within our manufacturing industries. And exactly the same process applies to electric vehicles. So we went very quickly, build loads of electric vehicles with no recycling facilities for that. So all of that energy is lost. There's a massive upfront carbon input and then it's all lost. And the same thing will happen with our fuel cells, with our electrolyzers, if we don't establish the circular economy that goes alongside that, and that we make sure that all of that energy continues to be used as much as possible. You'll always have new energy inputs, but at the end of the day, if we can use our resources to the maximum, we're reducing that. So it's the classic old school sustainable development agenda that needs to be built alongside our net zero planning.
Thank you. The next poll question is, do you think hydrogen technology should feature as a key solution in the UK government's decarbonising transport plan? I guess, Bjorn, from your perspective, how much of a role was transport in the European hydrogen strategy? And or are there other strategies or policy documents that are obviously focused on decarbonising transport, where hydrogen vehicles are playing a very significant role?
Let me try and answer. So I think in general, the transport sector, as it is seen to contribute, 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions in European Union, of course, is in focus of the regulator. And as we see from the last week's published Fit for 55 program, the focus on technologies which are applicable for new registrations will soon shift away from the combustion engine as per the proposals of today, because we are not valuing that they could be operated with synthetic fuels on a climate neutral base. So they want to shift it towards hydrogen and electric, or hydrogen electric and battery electric mobility. That's for the transport applications on road, maritime, and aviation is a different story. But there are more regulations that come into picture. We mentioned already the infrastructure of hydrogen refueling stations. So we are quite happy and we welcome to see that we have a strong push on the alternative fuel infrastructure directive. So the proposal recommends or calls for a fueling station every 150 kilometers for heavy duty trucks, which means something like 2,000 hydrogen refueling stations need to be built in the next years. This is a strong push. And last not least, Europe is now really discussing a concrete step into a transport and building emission trading system for CO2. And the proposal also calls for a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the order of 43% compared to 2005. And for this, hydrogen-powered cars, if they are carbon-neutral hydrogen-powered cars, they are, of course, an important player, especially in the good transportation of road transport. So for all the trucks that go with heavy loads and on long haul, I think they are more or less the only fulfillment option that is right now seen in European Union.
Okay, so we'll just quick, almost yes/no response from you, Mark and Jen. Do you think hydrogen transport has got a big role, or should have a big role, in the government's decarbonising transport plans? To you first, Jen.
I think it depends how you define big. I think one of the really important aspects of hydrogen for transport is about choice. So if you live in an area where it's very challenging to find a good electrical supply, then hydrogen provides you choice. At the moment, if you are someone who tows something as a regular thing, whether it's a boat, a caravan, a battery electric vehicle is not particularly useful to you. And so we need something that can provide you with a little bit more power. So there is an element of decarbonisation and choice and taking people on the journey. So it wasn't a yes/no answer, but it is kind of part of the what is big.
Okay. And you, Mark?
It's a part, should be a part.
Great, thanks. And I think now, thank you very much for that, all three of you. I think now we're going to go to questions that we've been receiving through the session. So the first question from Arno is, who is eventually able to bring power directly to people? I mean, global population and not those in the Western world. Mark, you can see that question. Do you have any
I can
thoughts?
see it. I'm not sure I totally understand it, if I'm honest.
No, I'm not sure. Could we perhaps go to the next question? Thank you. So this question is, so the challenge is getting hydrogen into my home. A tanker, or will it be a pipe installed? Or will I need a local electrolyzer? None of these options seem ideal, so what's the solution? I guess here in the UK, we are doing a lot of research into converting the domestic gas grid from natural gas to hydrogen, and we've done this before in the 1960s. We converted the gas supply then, so we've already gone through this process. We've just opened some hydrogen homes up in Gateshead, up in the northeast, and indeed the Energy Minister was up there last week and remarked that she'd had the opportunity to fry an egg on a hob that had been powered by hydrogen. But I guess not everyone is connected to the gas grid, so it's probably going to be different solutions or no hydrogen solution. They will be converted to heat pump. But Mark, what are the ways that people are going to be getting hydrogen to their home?
I think it's hard. It's easy to rule some things out. It won't make sense to have a home electrolyser. It might be economic at some point to have a tank at your home, but I'm slightly sceptical of that. The most likely thing is if hydrogen makes it to your home, it'll come through a pipe.
And Jen, Bjorn, would you agree? If hydrogen is going to be in your home, it's going to be coming through a pipe?
I think from my point of view, 100%, particularly in the UK or other countries that have a similar gas distribution network. Again, this could potentially be regional, and the gas distribution network is set up to have different parts of it using hydrogen and some potentially using biogas and methane. So I think if that is the case, it will come down a pipeline. It makes no sense to build new homes with a hydrogen system. It makes much more sense that all new homes are built with heat pumps.
And I fully agree with the sequence that was counted by Mark. I would probably add, if all of these options doesn't work for you, then there should still be the option of the power to liquid. So why don't you just continue with whatever you have today, but defossilize it? Anyway, I explained already, for global energy trade, we will need it anyways. Thank you.
I'm going to go to the fourth question on our screen, which is surely the whole point of hydrogen is decarbonisation. Before opening to the panelists, I would argue against that, because the way I see it, and I'm not a technological expert, but to me, hydrogen is also a huge job creation and economic opportunity, particularly in the UK, because we have companies here like Ceres, like JCB that I mentioned earlier, like Wrightbus, like ITM who do the electrolyzers, like Alstom who want to make trains, like Baxi who also do boilers, like ZeroAvia who do planes, and then there's a whole load of other organisations that are supporting these sort of end-use technologies. So to me, hydrogen is, yes, decarbonisation, and that's great, and that was kind of where it first came about, but really, here in the UK, it's a huge opportunity to be at the forefront of what is going to be a massive industry across the world. But am I wrong? Am I kind of believing the hype, do you think, Mark?
No, I think the way change happens is when people value problems. That means jobs, it means commerce, it means export. It means export of things like machines and like infrastructure projects, but it also means export of technology. It means opportunities for scientists to go and explore things. There was a question about, will there be other ways like light splitting of hydrogen? Yeah, probably, and there'll be hundreds of researchers working on that Holy Grail challenge, because if we can get there, that creates another tool for us. So for me, it's about endeavour, it's about science, it's about commerce, it's about jobs, it's about industry, and it's about decarbonisation. I don't think you can ever tease those things apart.
Thank you. Bjorn, would you agree? Hydrogen is more than about decarbonisation.
I fully agree. In general, we are talking about sustainability, and that's also more than just climate neutrality. So being sustainable means we have to account for economic strengths, we have to take care about social balances, and of course to find the way to climate neutrality. And I think hydrogen suits all of these three sustainability aspects.
And to you, Jen Baxter, as well, and we're going to start to bring the session to a close. So I guess in your response to the question is hydrogen more than just decarbonisation? Are there any other final comments or points that you'd like to raise?
I think I fully agree with both Mark and Bjorn, and with you that hydrogen provides opportunity. It's going to enable us to develop new systems, new technologies, new skills, new economy, new business models that support decarbonisation of all of our industries and of our lifestyles. And I don't think that it's the holy grail or the only thing that's going to do this. I think one of the things that we really need to do across the whole of the decarbonisation sector is to support each other. I think one of the things that we often find is that there's a lot of arguments about what is the right way to do something, and that just causes confusion and delay, and we need to make sure that what we're doing is championing each other and working as a system, as Mark said several times. Once we get that, once we understand it, then the whole of the decarbonisation will continue to actually action the things that we need to do to meet the targets and to improve everybody's lives.
Thank you. Bjorn, I'll come back to you. Any final points that you'd like to raise?
My final point is I like the discussion that we had here, and that we all see a great perspective in hydrogen. And the final point could be really start executing, building up the hydrogen ecosystem. Just phrasing ambitious targets won't be enough to also compete with other regions that woke up already, like in China and US.
Right, and thank you. And Mark, any final comments from you?
Yeah, I think the last thing I would say is, and this has sort of been implicit in some of the way we've talked about this, the least interesting question and the journey we go on in the next 10 years or next 30 years, and the least interesting question in clean tech is what's going to win? There isn't going to be a winner. There's going to be lots of solutions and lots of technologies and lots of jobs, and it's going to be a positive change. But it's not going to be one thing. There's going to be lots of winners. And the only issue is when we start playing the game.
Great. All right, we'll draw it to a close. Thank you everyone for watching at home. Thank you for everyone who participated in the questions and fed in their questions to the panel as well. I believe those who want to re-watch it, this is going to be available to watch later on YouTube or somewhere else on the internet. And we hope that anyone who's not been able to watch live but has watched now has still enjoyed watching, has learned a lot. And I think really the key point is that hydrogen is a big opportunity and we just need to start moving as quick as we can. Thank you.